Shalom, shalom, and this is Rabbi Moshe Otero. I want to continue with where we left off on this topic of disobedience to military orders based on biblical, Talmudic, Midrashic, and exegetical analysis to an all-too-contemporary question written by Moshe Sokolow. And I think it's a wonderful treatise on this issue of, when you get an order from an official in the military and you disobey that order, based on what are you allowed to do so? So we looked at a couple of different exhibits that Moshe had presented. Number one was the exhibit 1, Joab's trial. Number 2 exhibit was that of Abner and Amasa and disobedience there. And then we looked at the third exhibit presented by Joab and disobedience in its contrast. And now we're on the fourth exhibit that's being presented by Moshe Sokolow, and that is crime and agency. The Talmud in Kedushin 43a stipulates if one commissions an agent to commit murder and he complies, the agent is guilty and the principal is exempt. You see, Shammai the elder said in the name of the prophet Haggai, the principal is guilty, as it states of David regarding Uriah. You slew Uriah by the sword and killed him by the sword of the Ammonites. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 9. Now, given this negative assessment of Joab's morality, as we saw in the third exhibit, why do the sages not rebuke him openly for his complicity in Uriah's death by applying Shammai's principle that every individual bears responsibility for his own deeds and cannot abrogate the responsibility, arguing that he was only following orders? The contemplation of this question leads us to our third and final observation on the halachot of obedience. The rule of delegated responsibility stops short of the throne. Just above we cited, and you slew Uriah by the sword, and you killed him by the sword of the Ammonites. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 9. Rabbi Kimshi, the Radak, who lived in province in around 1160 to 1235, commenting on this ostentable redundancy, slew, killed, notes as a soldier, even commanders in the heat of the battle are entitled to take for granted that their commander-in-chief, the king, has done the necessary value clarifications. They may therefore assume implicitly that any order he gives is legal. It's not always the case, though. And you slew him, and although you had slain him, personally, by instructing Joab to place him in harm's way, you in fact killed him. Why the repetition? You have compounded the felony by having him slain by the Ammonites, the enemies of Israel. Our sages have said, although the universal rule is that there is no agency for the commission of a crime, in every case the agent and not the principal is culpable. Hence the situation differs, since from the verse it calls David a killer. Why is this? Since he was the king and his word was law. It is as though he did the killing himself. Similarly, when Saul ordered the killing of the Kohanim of Nov, it was as though he killed them himself. Generally, when a person would refrain from following the king's order in such a case, we have explained apropos of anyone who defies your word shall die. Joshua chapter 1, verse 18. Only in this do we understand and include the commission of a crime, as the verse states. Only be firm and resolute, excluding instruction to violate Torah law. Not everyone, however, is capable of construing buts and onlys. The onus punishment, therefore, is on the king. Now, let's take a look at Exhibit 5 that Moshe Sokolow presents, and that is what goes around comes around. The principle of royal responsibility articulated by Radak, the Rebbe Kimshi, takes an additional significance when we view it in the context of David and Joab later's interaction incomparable situation. According to 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1 and on, and in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 1 and on, David is induced to commission a census of Israel and instructs Joab to carry it out. The text in 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1 through 4 reports, "And again the anger of God was kindled against Israel, and he moved to David against them, saying, Go, number Israel and Judah. And the king said to Joab, the captain of the host that was with him, Go now, and throw through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan even to Beersheba, and number the people, that I may know the sum of the people." Obviously, we know what happened as a result of that. "And Joab said unto the king, Now the Lord thy God add unto the people how many they may be, and be 100-fold, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. And why does my lord the king delight in this thing?" Nonetheless, or notwithstanding, the king's word prevailed against Joab and against the captains of the host, and Joab and the captains of the host went out from the presence of the king to number the people of Israel. Joab initially opposes the mission, saying, according to 2 Samuel, what do you need it for? Lama chafetz hadavar hazeh. And adding, according to 1 Chronicle, why cause Israel's guilt? Lama yiyeh lima'ashama le'Israel. This clearly implies that while Joab ultimately submitted to the order on the account of the rule of royal responsibility, which is Vayahesek Devar HaMelech El Yoav, he again recognizes its essential illegality, or at least impropriety. While Abner and Amasa, in a similar situation, as we saw in Exhibit 2, tendered their resignation to Shaul, Joab, as was his wont, abdicated his moral responsibility, albeit remaining strictly within the limits of the letter of the law. Now, in conclusion, the source that we have presented here indicated the responsibility of ensuring that the orders issued in the frontline soldiers are legal and moral belongs, and foremost to the king in his capacity as commander-in-chief. Officers of lower grade, including the chief of staff, may assume his orders to be proper, and particularly if they are in the heat of battle and lack the necessary leisure to evaluate it on their own. However, if they definitely know a particular order to be illegal or immoral, they must refuse to carry it out, and if necessary, suffer the consequences of their disobedience to the point of surrendering their commissions. In some cases, given the patently egregious nature of a legal order, they must also protest it publicly. Looking at what happened in Afghanistan, these chief commanders had the responsibility to respond to Biden and did not do so. They should have been willing to go against him at that point, according to what we understand from biblical purviews. But here is where the guilt of both the chief of military and the chief of the military, Biden, is at a state of guilty. The operative and normative conclusions. In conclusion, we recite several codification of laws of military obedience. The Rambam in Hilchot Melachim, chapter 3, verse 9. Those of you who speak Spanish, you can find a copy of this same sefer on Amazon, which I translated into Spanish. Whoever defies a royal order on the account of preoccupation with the mitzvot, even a minor variety, is not culpable. When the master and the servant both speak, the master's word takes precedent. It goes out without saying, however, that if the king commanded that a mitzvah be annulled, he is not to be obeyed. Rav Shlomo min Chachar in Dinei Tzava ul Milchama, laws pertaining to army and warfare, number 28. The regulation of the general staff and military rabbinates are available to assist soldiers in all cases. According to regulation, orders that contravene halacha are invalid. So they go against halacha, it is an invalid order. The U.S. Department of Army Field Manual says the law of land warfare, on page 182, military courts are admonished to take into consideration the facts that obedience to law lawful orders is the duty of every member of the armed forces, that the latter cannot be expected in conditions of war discipline to weigh scrupulously the legal merits of the orders received. Number 4, the American Law Institute. The model of Penal Code, Military Orders, Chapter 2, Verse 10. It is an affirmative defense that the actor, engaging in the conduct of charge to constitute an offense, does no more than execute an order of his superior in the armed forces which he does not know to be unlawful. Practical pedagogy. Now, let's consider some questions here, and this would be a good review for those of you who like to study. First of all, we have the first source in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 28 and on. On what charge is Joab condemned to death? And how did Joab think to evade his fate? Was he unsuccessful? Now, regarding Sanhedrin chapter 49a, how does Joab justify his killing of Abner or of Amasa? What is Solomon's challenge to that justification? And what is the final disposition of Joab's case? Regarding 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 17, the Yerushalmi Sanhedrin and Sanhedrin 20a and 49a, what does Abner and Amasa have in common? How does this reflect on Joab? What do these sources teach us about protesting illegal orders? Now, looking at Shabbat 55a, we should ask ourselves, what does Ezekiel chapter 9 teach us about protest, to protest, and how does it apply in the case of Joab? Kedushin chapter 43a, Rabbi Kimshi's commentary on 1 Samuel 12:9. What is the limitation placed here on the law of agency? Shlichut. Those of you who know that shlichut is agency or emissarial work. What bearing does it have in the case of David and Uriah? On Joab, who is the ultimate responsibility for the morality in warfare? Now, regarding the Rambam's Hilchot Melachim, chapter 3, verse 9, we've got to ask ourselves, which of our sources is Rambam's to? Does he disagree or agree with Rabbi Kimshi? Would he have convicted Joab as charged? Regarding 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1 and on, and also 1 Chronicles chapter 21 and on, what does 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 3 add to 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 3? Why did David's census invite guilt? Remember, the Torah commands not to count Kalal Yisrael directly, but would use money to do so. But he went out and counted the children of Israel, bringing upon himself the sin. So Exodus chapter 30, verse 12, and commentaries makes a very clear reference to that. So here we end with the issues, and we have some additional notes I think I should share with you by Moshe Sokolow, which is very important. He talks about consideration here, otherwise enlightening precedents of the midwives who disobeyed Pharaoh's order to commit genocide. First of all, it does not necessarily involve Jews who would be bound by the halakha in any event, because it falls outside the scope of the military discipline. He treats it here as an obligation to intervene in halakha and tradition. In other words, here we have the midwives that basically disobeyed the Pharaoh's order to abort. Interesting enough, just because you're commanded to abort, it doesn't mean you have to be involved in facilitating and being part of that. Number 2, while we will not pursue the element of the sanctuary per se, and any further bears investigation, according to Exodus chapter 21, verse 14, with comments of the Babylonian Talmud in Makot 12a, where they can be protected, or could they not be protected and removed from the premises to be executed. Blood vengeance is an acceptable form of retribution according to Torah law. We find that in Numbers chapter 35, verse 19. And therefore becomes a rodef, a pursuer. And we know that the laws of a pursuer, that a person that is pursuing to do harm can be, you might say, neutralized before he achieves his purpose, and may be stymied even at the cost of his own life, providing there's no alternative. Sanhedrin, Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 49a. We look at also El HaChomesh in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 23, where significantly Joab's killing of Amasa is described in the identical terms. Achim verachim, the pejorative of the royalty in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14 and 20 should be looked at. Also expressed in both is Ein Shali'ah Lidavar Avera. There is no agency for a crime, translated as a sin, and Divrei Ha'arav v'Divrei Ha'talmid, Divrei Meshomim, if instructed by a master and a disciple, to whom does one listen to? Obviously, to the master. In this case, the Master HaKadosh Baruch Hu is whom is above all of us. Exodus chapter 30, verse 12, and the commentaries there in 2 Samuel should be reviewed. Incredible topic touched by Moshe Sokolow. And if Moshe Sokolow is watching, since he contributed this article to Rabbi Mark Angel's material of Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideal, the 15th issue in the winter version, 2013, 5773, on page 154 and on. I'm sorry, from pages 1, and I misquoted here, from pages 144 to pages 152 in the Institute for Jewish Ideas. Wonderful material, especially so apropos as we're seeing all of this military issues being brought out. Should have the generals disobeyed the order of Biden? I think they should have. There is the possibility of genocide, the murder of these 13 military men and those that were left behind is something that many people will still be talking about. In the Jewish world, the same thing. We don't leave our men behind. And there's a responsibility on the chief of the military, which happens to be either the king, in this case King David, or that of the President of the United States. I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly did. This will be uploaded on my YouTube channel for those to review. And I want to wish you and all of you watching a Shabbat Shalom and a Shana Tova, and may Hashem the King rule the hearts of men and the bodies of everyone until the time when he brings his kingdom, his government, here palpably on earth. Shalom, shalom.